Hello and welcome to Unit 9, Part 5. My name is Mr. Bell and today we're going to talk about piecewise functions. On this slide it says, given the function g of x is equal to, we have two different scenarios. We have x squared plus 5, comma, when x is less than 0, and then we're going to use x minus 3, comma, when x is greater than or equal to 0. What is the range when the domain is -5, -3, -1, 0, and 20? So, like the title of this lesson says, a piecewise function means the function has different pieces. Okay, so right now we have two functions to choose from, or two equations to plug in and evaluate. We have the x squared plus 5 and the x minus 3. Now, how do you know which function to use? That's where the comma and this other part comes into play. If x is a value less than 0, we're going to use this function. But as soon as we hit equal to 0 or anything bigger than 0, we've got to use this second function. So keep that in mind when we're working out this particular problem. So just to help me out, I'm going to draw a table for my x and y values, my domain and range. The first value of my domain, which is the x values, is a -5. Okay, now I've got to think, which of those two functions am I supposed to use? Well, -5 is a value that is less than 0, so I need to use this particular function. I'm going to try to do it in a different color here. So for that first function, I'm going to use this one, except plug in the -5 in place of x and see what I get. Well, -5 squared is 25. 25 plus 5 is 30. So the first member of my range is a 30. Okay, let's move on to the next member of the domain, which is a -3. So I've got to decide now which function do I use. -3 is also less than 0, so I'm going to be using the same function, which is x squared plus 5. And this time, instead of a -5, I'm going to plug in my new member of the domain, which is a -3. Well, -3 squared is 9. 9 plus 5 is 14. And there's my next member of the range. Let's continue with -1. -1 is still a value less than a 0, so I'm still using that very first or top function there. X squared plus 5. Instead of the x, I'm going to plug in the -1. The -1 squared is +1. 1 plus 5 is 6, giving me my third member of the range. Okay, take a look at the fourth member, which is 0. Now be careful here. The first one to use is if x is less than 0. Well, 0 is not less than 0. 0 is actually greater than or equal to 0. So since my domain, or my x value, is 0, and that's what this criteria meets, that tells me to use this function. So I'm using a different function this time. I'll use a different color to see if that helps visualize it. This function is x minus 3. Well, in place of the x this time, I'm plugging in the 0. 0 minus 3 is a -3, so that means this member of the range is -3. And my last example there for the domain is 20. Let's think about which function to use. 20 is a value greater than or equal to 0, so that tells me to use this particular equation or function, which is x minus 3, and our x value, our member of the domain, is 20. 20 minus 3 is 17. Finishing out with 17 as the last member of the range. So my range here is 30, 14, 6, -3, and 17. Okay, so for the first three values of the range, I had to use the top function because my domains were less than 0. And then for my last two members, I had to use the second function here, because those domain values were greater than or equal to 0. All right, thanks for watching. Hope this helps.